Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this stream on YouTube or on Rumble. I had to start this live streaming today a little bit earlier, around 10 minutes earlier, because in around 1 hour, I will be on Judge Napolitano's podcast, which is a live. So I have to finish this live streaming with you before I go to Judging for Freedom podcast, and we're going to address how dangerous the situation is at the current moment in Syria. And in this stream, I'm also going to shed light on Syria as well, especially in the light of the visits of several European and American officials to Syria. And after the visit, claiming that Syria is now on the right track and that finally the breezes of freedom has arrived to my country. Whether you believe them or not, this is up to you, but I'm not naive to believe that American officials or British officials or German officials are in Syria to endorse the freedom-loving rebels. This is about geopolitics. This is about finances. This is about energy. Yeah, after that, probably they would focus more on human rights and especially on the women's rights from the German side, for example. But mostly, this is going to be about geopolitics. And accordingly, the sanction regime that the US and other European countries have imposed on Syria, they will discuss the fate of these, let's say, sanctions when and if the HDS government they serve the interests of the Americans and the Europeans to the full extent. One of our friends says, "Hi, Kevork, I was a large Assad supporter. How do you feel about the way Assad left?" I already addressed this point previously, but for you to know, my friend, when I was first asked about Assad, this was probably 13, 14 years ago, and people ask me, why don't you join the revolution and this and that? I received lots of offers to join the revolution as well, including financial incentives to join the so-called revolution. And I rejected because I knew that this is a foreign-funded insurgency, and the foreign funders, the foreign intelligence apparatuses in the region and abroad, in the US, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, etc., they don't have the best interests of the Syrian people in their heart, and what they need from Syria is to change course in the foreign policy level and not some democratic reforms as they claim to be. Now, therefore, I said that Assad's duty is to stay in Syria and fight this foreign-funded insurgency, because if he doesn't do that, then he is a traitor, that he left his constitutional duties, and he left the countries for the foreign-backed Islamist insurgents, mostly were motivated by creating an Islamic state in Syria. And this has been proven later by a document which was leaked to the press. And this document was a classified document belonging to the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States, in which they addressed Barack Obama back then in 2012, telling him that the driving force behind the insurgency in Syria are the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda. And they said that these groups want to establish an Islamic emirate. And they said that the allies of these insurgents in the Gulf monarchies, they see this as a positive development, because then they can press Assad and force him into concessions. So this was my opinion about Assad, that he should stay and he should fight, and this has to be supported against a foreign-backed insurgency. And if he left, I said in 2011 or 2012, I would have called him a traitor. This is what I said. And accordingly, I endorsed his let's say, the approach only against the Al-Qaeda types and ISIS types and these groups who are takfiris and they want to establish a caliphate or one-colored state, because Syria is a melting pot of different civilizations and religions, and I wanted for Syria to stay diverse and not to be a one-colored state, right? So when he left the way he left, I again said that he betrayed his own people. by the way he left. Although I know that he himself probably was betrayed, and I know that there were so many other factors and conditions why he left. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is, after 2018, when the hot war was over and we were in an era when Syria had its allies like China, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and others helped Syria to relatively stabilize the country on the security level. Now, this was the time for political compromises and to find a solution which could end the war. And this is something that he failed to do with the local partners in the country and with the neighboring countries, especially with Turkey. And I know there are so many factors why Assad didn't meet, for example, with Erdogan. I know all these things, but at the end of the day, he was the captain of a ship. And when this ship sank, who is the responsible for it, right? I can't really come and blame everyone. I will blame the captain for not really calculating well all these steps ahead. So I was also very disappointed, and many people do not accept my opinion nowadays, because I say the way Assad left is criminal. It's like he committed a crime against not only the Syrian people, but also the Syrian civilization, the Syrian army, the future of Syria as a united country, as a country which everyone can live, even refugees coming from Iraq and Palestine and Lebanon. They all used to live in peace and harmony in the country without obstacles. If you're Iraqi or Palestinian and you want to study in Syria, you can study for free in Syria, right? So Syria was a really good place before this war erupted. Anyways, in today's episode, because Annalena Baerbock was in Syria, and she said she urged HTS not to Islamize the country. And I said, what kind of logic is this? You know, HTS is an Islamist group. Jolani was the founder of the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria. Jolani was the partner of Baghdadi. Like as much as you put makeup in his face and try to rebrand him, it's not going to change the core of the issue, which is this person and his group, they believe in an ideology that is calling for establishing an Islamic state in Syria. And I'm not going to come and say now like an Islamic state is a bad thing or a good thing. For me, as Syrian, as someone who believes in a diverse country, and someone who believes that everyone should be treated equally in front of a civil constitution, from this position, I say I'm against an Islamic state. That's why I don't go and live in an Islamic state, for example. Syria has not been an Islamic state. It wasn't a secular state per se, but it wasn't an Islamic state. In Syria before, for example, the fall of the regime. So if you go to the court, and there is a serious case in a court, for example, so you have the laws and the regulations, you have the interpretations of the judges, you have the previous court rulings, so you have different layers before you reach to a decision in a court. And if all these layers were absent and you don't have anything that you can rely on to come to a decision in a court, then on the fourth level, the last resort was the Sharia law. So Sharia was not on the first level for jurisdiction, but on the fourth level of jurisdiction. And now what HTS is trying to do to bring the Sharia as the first place in jurisdiction. And this will definitely go against the rights and the duties and the responsibilities of the people who are not Muslim, or even if they're Muslim, they don't believe in the Islamic law as the law that can achieve their aspirations in a civil state. So there are so many Muslims and Sunnis in Syria themselves, especially in Damascus and Aleppo. They're not, for example, they're secular. They're Muslims, but they don't impose their way of life or their rules on the others. HTS is just the opposite, right? So when I said that, I tried to explain when HTS came to power, I said, look, what they're going to try to do is not to establish an Islamic state from day one, but they will try to pave the way for creating an Islamic state. And this is, for them, is a long-term process. You can't just come and establish an Islamic state from day one. But what you can do, you can take over the media, which they already have done. You can take over the Ministry of, I think, called Endowment, which is Awqaf. This is the Ministry of Religious Affairs. So you preach and you interpret Islam the way you like in HTS, and then you take over the Ministry of Education and change the curriculum. And when you have the military and you have the absolute power over the media, what people watch and listen, and what people learn in school, and what the pupils and the followers of Islam listen to when they go to mosque or when they study Islamic law, then you control their minds, you control their hearts, and then if they reject it, then you have the weapons. So you have an absolute power. So basically, what happened is they removed a political authoritarianism, which was a pan-Arabist secular system, by another authoritarian theocracy, which is going to be even worse. So this was my argument from the beginning when this event started to happen. And one of the evidence for what I said has been in the past week when HTS started changing the curriculum of Syria, right? So as you see what's happening now, they're changing the textbooks in Syria. And the term martyr, for example, who is a martyr, right? For me, a martyr is or was is and was someone who sacrificed his soul for the sake of the country when there is a war or a conflict against a foreign invader, right? Like if, let's say, just for an argument's sake, if country A was invaded, let's call, I don't know, I don't want to name countries, but just for an argument's sake, and since most of you are from the United States, let's suppose America has been invaded by country A, right? And if somebody died during the conflict from the Americans, then he's a martyr because he died for his nation defending his own country. But if somebody comes and says, no, we have to change the concept of martyrdom, then we will make it like a sacrifice for the sake of God. So if an American got killed, then the American government would only consider him a martyr if he died for the sake of God. So this is what HTS is trying to do. This is the Islamization of the Syrian state. As we can see, the new Syria school textbooks are moving from a nationalist to Islamist interpretation of Syrian history. So now a martyr is no longer someone who dies defending the homeland, but someone who dies for God. This is what they changed, right? This is in Arabic. They say martyr. So a martyr has been someone who died for like he sacrificed himself during a war in defense of his homeland. Now this has changed to another thing, which is like defending somebody who lost his life for raising the name of God. So this is how they changed it now. In addition to it, we can see that in the education text, for example, this is in the first grade text, right? Those with whom God is angry. So look how they're discriminating already against the Christians and the Jews. So they say now in the new curriculum, we're talking about first grade text, guys. So just a puppy, right? The small kid. So this is quote from the textbook. It says, those with whom God is angry and who have lost their way should now be replaced by the words Jews and Christians. So Jews and the Christians are now the people with whom God is angry. And what does God do when he is angry with someone like the Jews and the Christians? He punishes them, right? So where is this leading to? And so when you establish an Islamic state or any religious state, a Hindu state in Syria, and I'm not pretending to know Hinduism, right? I'm just making assumptions. So let's suppose in Hinduism, they say the people of B and people of C are infidels, or people or God is angry at people B and C. So if Hindus come to power and impose their religion as in the textbooks of the children, then from early ages, you're already instilling in their minds hatred against certain people. So this is what HTS is doing at the current moment in Syria. And this is very, very dangerous because, as you may know, Syria probably has 20 to 30% of minorities. Joshua says, nothing is surprising about these changes to Syria's school textbooks. They are in line with traditional Islamic education. And this is not, by the way. Joshua Landes is trying to whitewash HTS here because there are so many Islamic countries, there are countries that put Islam in the first place of jurisdiction. And it's Islamic country, especially in the Gulf countries, they don't put these texts in the first grade curriculum. This is not true. Even Saudi Arabia is changing this. Imagine that we in Syria, we used to see Saudi Arabia's curriculum as backward. Now in Syria is more backward, getting more backward than in Saudi Arabia. Joshua Landes, like, we know each other, and I know that he's not really being here honest, just being diplomatic, the most diplomatic way. So he says the problem is that they will shock secular Syrians and many Christians, not to mention Alawis, Druze, and Ismailis, who are considered to be worse than Christians and Jews, and who are not protected within Islamic law because they are not considered to be people of the book. Jews and Christians are simply misguided, not unbelievers. So under HTS, the Jews and the Christians will still be considered the people of the book because under Islam, if you if you take it the way it is written, the Christians and the Jews are the people of the book because they believe in the same God. But the Alawites, the Druze, the Yazidis, and other smaller Ismailis and smaller minorities in Syria and also in Iraq, for example, why the Yazidis were genocided, because they don't consider them even part of the book, which is they don't see them as believers of God, the same God that, like, if I am Christian and Jolani is Muslim, right? But in his mind, I'm still someone who believes in the same God that he believes in. At the end of the day, we believe in the same God. Probably the prophets are different, but we believe in the same God. But I'm saying just for the other smaller minorities which bring some of philosophical aspects into their religion, they don't even consider them as the people of the book. So their situation is going to be even worse than the Christians and the Jews, for example. Jews are very, very small percentage anyways in Syria nowadays. So the Alawites, the Druze, the Ismailis, Yazidis, they are going to pay a bigger price in this under Jolani's regime. So now let's go to science. So in the science curriculum for the junior year, this is third grade in high school, modifications to the curriculum in the Syrian Arab Republic of the academic year 2025, the entire unit on evolution to be deleted. So evolution, there is no longer evolution. It's God created Adam and Eve, and evolution is not going to be considered part of the curriculum. This is because within a religious framework, God created man and the universe. Now, like, look, under Assad was the same. Like, we had science and we learned about evolution, and at the same time we had religion class. So we studied both. I know it's contradictory, but they didn't tell us which one is the correct one. The teacher of science said science is correct, and the teacher of religion said that God is correct, right? So there's not going to be this diverse, let's say, science-based and religious-based curriculum, but rather only religion-based curriculum. So evolution no longer exists under Jolani's regime, just for you to know. We have another thing in the same Syrian textbook for the third year in high school. The part about the development of the brain is to be deleted. Apparently, this science conflicts with God's creation. So they no longer, our brains didn't develop through time, but rather it came the way it is from day one, just like God wanted, according to the new curriculum. There are so many other things, like for example, in history, they're deleting everything that condemns the Ottoman Empire, for example, and this only indicates that HTS because it's a proxy for Turkey, right? And Erdogan. So in this, for example, I don't know if I can show this anyways. So the new Syrian government has mandated that all reference to the Ottoman execution of the Syrian and Lebanese Muslim, Christian, and Arab nationalists be expunged from school textbooks. They were executed in Damascus and Beirut on 6 May 1916 by Jamal Pasha. We call him Jamal Pasha Safah in Arabic, which is the butcher Jamal Pasha, the Ottoman wali of Greater Syria. They were executed in both the Marj Square in Damascus and Burj Square in Beirut. Both plazas have since been renamed Martyrs Square, and the date is commemorated in both countries as a national holiday. This deletion can only be explained as an effort to avoid offending Turkish sensibilities. Thank you very much. Finally for being honest about this. I just want to thank Mr. Rifley. Can't wait to hear your take on Assad's fall. I already, like, if you go for in the previous 4, 5, 6 live streamings, it's been all about this issue, right? And I've spoken in length about it. And I will also show you now, I will just give you the title of the video or just simply show you which one I'm talking about. So there is a video on my YouTube channel, guys. If you go to my YouTube channel, so this is the newer one. Now we are live, and if you go down, the end of Bashar al-Assad's rule in Syria, I said this was 4 weeks ago with 47,000 views, and after that we're all about these cases, so you can go through and learn more, let's say, about my opinion about this if you're interested. Now, beside this change in the curriculum, there is something important also happening in the streets. For example, we have this banner in Homs, in the central city of Syria, and now they are advocating for all women to wear hijab in the streets, and what are the rules and how you can wear a hijab in Syria, and what is allowed and what is not allowed. I've seen also video from Jable. Jable is on the coastal side of Syria, and there is a campaign, spontaneous campaign of women wearing a niqab, completely covered their faces and wearing black, and they are handing over this type of dresses to other women in the streets and encouraging them to dress it. So I have to be very honest with you and careful about what I say, because I am not against any dress code, especially the religious one. Like, if you're someone who believes that you have to, like you have to wear a turban, you have to wear anything, right? For the sake of your religion, if this makes you feel comfortable, if you believe that your God says that you have to do this, 100%, no worries. Kein Problem. Kein Problem. There's no problem about that. But I am against forcing women or forcing anyone to dress in a certain way. I'm not talking about now getting in public in naked. This is a completely different thing, right? I'm talking about imposing a dress code on someone. That's why when the protests started in Iran, this was 1.5 years ago, and I criticized Iran and I said, they have to be more flexible about these things. It's like they're inviting foreign intervention in their country by enforcing certain dress code on women. And some people, of course, come and say, no, there is no dress code. But there are so many other videos that we see that there is a morality police harassing some women or asking them to cover their heads, etc., etc. And this causes problems. Not everyone wants to do that. So I'm for this individual choice and decision for someone to choose what type of dress code they have to wear. But imposing this type of dress now, or encouraging women to wear, because this is going to create social pressure now in the country, that people, especially men, will be like, they don't want to hear something from their neighbor because people whisper and in the neighborhood or in the society, so they don't want anyone to whisper about their woman, about their wife or sister or cousin, etc. So everyone starts acting like they are the guardian of the owner of the woman, and they start imposing the dress code on them. So this is going to happen more and more and more in Syria. In addition to it, I've seen this week countless of videos which disgusted me, right? I've seen videos which disgusted me. And I've seen such videos before, and I thought this is in our back. And I thought that we will not see such vile videos ever again, but we have seen so many of them in the past weeks, and especially in Homs and in Latakia. So in Homs and Latakia, there are big Alawite presence and Christian presence, and these HDS militants and terrorists, basically, they have been terrorizing the local people. There were indefinite number of lootings, there were killings, there were vengeful acts, there were summary executions, there were humiliations. There were videos, for example, like they go to some town and they capture old men and they bring them into some square, and at gunpoint they start asking them to howl like a dog. If you don't howl, you get killed, right? I've seen video of HTS terrorists storming into a house of someone, and while they were going inside, there was a little kid standing in front of the house. They gave her the smartphone, the video, to capture video, and while they stormed inside, there were basically people inside, and while they were shooting these people, they let the kid to capture this video while they're killing the babies or the kid's family. There was an incident of famous singer in Syria. They stormed his apartment in Homs and they killed his family. Most of them were women. And there's so many countless and countless of incidences, and those are the ones that were documented. Those are the ones that were reported. Those are the ones were captured on video. So imagine how many more there are offline, and we don't have any documentation for it. And those are the people that are who are now endorsed by the basically Western governments. This is one of the cases on Greek City Times. It's a great website if you like to follow the website as well, managed by a friend. The title says, HTS harass Greek Orthodox Christians who are openly wearing crosses. So the situation continues to deteriorate in the Valley of the Christians. This is called in Arabic Wadi al-Nasara, or the Valley of the Christians in Syria's Homs Governorate, with reports emerging that HTS militants are harassing people openly wearing crosses. The report comes following an announcement by HTS on January 5th that men and women on buses in the Greek Orthodox majority region would need to be segregated, with threats of consequences if this is not carried out. According to local Valley of Christians Facebook page, this threat was carried out with armed men who said they were from HTS stopping a bus and ordering the segregation of men and women. More information from local pages indicates it was a local HTS checkpoint and several buses were stopped, not just one. They were ordered to segregate so that men sat in the front and women in the back. Back then, at times, there were the black people sitting in the back and the men and the white people were sitting in the front when there were racist state or racist regulations in the United States. So now men will sit in the front and women will sit in the back. So last month, two Greek Orthodox Christians, their names were Sam'an Satme and Helena Khashuf, were murdered in the village of Jamasliya in Syria's Homs province. Although the murder was initially reported as burglary gone wrong, it later emerged that Sam'an was beheaded and Helena shot, indicating that there were other motives. So those were the victims of this HTS terrorist attack on Homs itself. Crazy times in Syria, crazy times. By the way, if you already saw the title of today's video, I'm going to address that very soon, by the way, just for you to know. I'm not like trying to do some clickbait things, but there were some details published or been said by the former media office of Assad, and some of these details are correct in my opinion, and we're going to shed light on this as well. However, before we go to that part of the stream, I just want to say that this week Washington has and the European countries are going, or they have already lifted some of the unilateral coercive measures, the sanctions, which were illegally imposed on Syria. And it is now reported that they're easing the restrictions on humanitarian aid for Syria, a move to speed delivery of basic supplies without lifting sanctions that restrict other assistance to the new government in Damascus. So this is what we argued for a long time, and we said that these sanctions are hindering reconstruction in the country. They say, no. This is not about reconstruction. They don't target humanitarian aid. But now they are easing these sanctions for the same exact reason that we were arguing against the sanctions for a long time. But back then, this was called an Assadist talking point. And now this is the reality where you see many even opposition journalists and previously opposition now, let's say HTS affiliated or HTS supporting journalists and activists and talking heads, they're now advocating against the sanctions. Back then, I was an Assadist for saying that these sanctions harm the Syrian people. So the way how it says that this decision underscores wariness about removing the broad sanctions on Syria until the direction taken by its new leader, led by a group that US labels a terrorist organization, becomes clearer. So they will see which direction he is going to pursue in terms of the foreign policy, of course, not in terms of the minorities and human rights. This is all about cliches, right? They want to see if Turkey will be able to have control over Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs and direct the country into a direction that NATO wants. And Qatar as well. And this is what's going to happen, but there are still some conflicting files, for example, the Kurds. What is going to happen to the Kurds? And Kurds and the Druze. I think those are the two files that they're going to try to solve. They don't care at all about the Alawites and the Christians. The Christians, can they put them in these planes of the NGOs and send them to Europe and to Canada and Australia or elsewhere? And they don't care if the Alawites were murdered. They don't care. They would also open refugee door for them. But what they really want is the Druze to be secured and the Kurds to be secured, open corridor between the Golan Heights, Sweda, which is mostly inhabited by the Druze, and also in the eastern shore of the Euphrates, where the US occupation forces are located or stationed, and where the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a Kurdish-dominated militia in the east of Syria. So easing some of these sanctions are going to be only for 6 months. And then the US also dropped the bounty of $10 million on Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. This was also check. So what else? The Jolani-led government is seeking recognition from world powers to legitimize his rule. Of course, they will give him this legitimacy sooner or later. But the Biden administration says that decisions about sanctions and whether to recognize this rebel-led government likely will be left to President-elect Donald Trump. I think this is the correct. This is what's going to happen recently. Although Annalena Baerbock and the French foreign minister, they were in Syria and they started talking about like, we are not going to give any money to this Islamist-led government unless women and the minorities' rights are respected. Like this is a ridiculous thing. Of course, they can make some cosmetics reforms. I mean, women and the minorities were respected anyways before HTS. Why did you bring a regressive and Islamist group which doesn't believe in any progressive ideas or any genuine protection for women and for education, right? For minorities. And anyways, I'm tired about this explaining and talking because they know, these Americans know, the French know, the Germans know, everybody know what I'm talking about. They just refuse to acknowledge it because it's inconvenient for their geopolitical interests in the region. Our yesterday's guest, Dr. David Miller, he made an amazing observation about this. He says the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. So the name of this office, which is imposing sanctions, is OFAC. OFAC. U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, he says, is one of the many imperial institutions in the U.S. effectively controlled by the Zionist movement, which is why it is incorrect to say that the U.S. uses Zionism or the Zionist states for its own end. The opposite is true. Under the leadership of Stuart Levy and then David Cohen, who went on the deputy director of CIA, OFAC was used almost exclusively to pursue the whims of the Zionist movement, sanctioning states and movements deemed a threat to Zionist interests. To learn more about the history of this economic warfare strategy directed by Zionist assets inside the US, read the book. This is the book's name, Treasury's War, by Juan Zarate, the George W. Bush appointee responsible for overseeing its implementation. What's happening here is that ISIS has now been sufficiently reputation laundered by US, Turkish, and GCC media to allow the Zionists squatting in the US Treasury's OFAC and the US itself to take ISIS-run Syria off the sanctions list. The threat of this being temporary is supposed to discipline the new ISIS regime, ensuring they don't go rogue by supporting the resistance or fighting Zionism, not that they ever would. Funny enough, one of the people who was very, let's say, enthusiastic about imposing these sanctions on Syria, some of you maybe already know him. If you're an American, Joe Wilson, right? Joe Wilson has been lobbying forever for more sanctions, more draconian measures against the Syrian people for over a decade. And now he says, I welcome these steps to ease the economic situation in Syria. These people are hypocrites. However, he says, I hope that Donald Trump will go further in allowing reconstruction and investment to help Syrians return home, invest in their own response, and rely less on taxpayer-funded humanitarian aid. So those were the people who led this sanction regime against Syria. Joe Wilson was one of the warheads, right, in drafting and promoting and executing the Caesar Act and many other sanction regimes against Syria. And once we opposed it as people, Syrian people, they said, oh, this is an Assadist talking point because we're sanctioning the Assad regime and his cronies, right? Anything that you say otherwise is just it's an Assadist talking point. And our friend, which I told you, if you're an ex, you could follow her. She's Syrian, Muslim, Sunni, if you're interested in that too. She says, look at all the Syrians in the replies thanking Joe Wilson, the same congressman who was outraged when weapons to Israel were delayed for the genocide against Gaza. Joe Wilson is one of the proudest Zionists in Congress, and so-called free Syrians thank him on the regular, licking his boots like good little. Yeah, I mean, I've seen many of them. One of the photos that I saw recently was fascinating, that Joe Wilson received so-called opposition figures in his office, and there was an Israeli flag behind them, and nobody even noticed that. So not only these people, by the way, we have lots of people, for example, who like they're pundits, they're journalists, and they've been pushing for this type of sanctions for a long time against Syria. And I argued and I said journalists and pundits who backed the regime change in Damascus are now pushing to lift the illegal unilateral sanctions on Syria because they hurt ordinary Syrians. I stand behind the message, but let's ask the tough question. Why did they support these sanctions in the first place? Because they prioritize political power over the suffering of millions of Syrians who endured these brutal, inhumane measures. So, one of the people who supported these sanctions against Syria is Zuhair al-Shimali. And Zuhair he studied in the SOAS University of London. He's from Aleppo, from the same city where I come from. And he is the head of research at Valent. So keep this organization in mind. See, he is the head of research at an organization called Valent Project, which they verify and news, and they say which is fake news and which is correct news. You know what they're trying to do with in the past few years, trying to label anyone who is going against a narrative to be spreading fake news or misinformation and disinformation. And this organization turned out to be a notorious organization trying to keep the narrative in line with the interests of the US, which today I noticed that only recently. So what this person told me is really, in my opinion, ridiculous and absurd. He said, the claim that sanctions were supported to prioritize political power over the suffering of millions oversimplifies and misrepresents the rationale behind them. Sanctions were primarily imposed as a response to the Assad regime's known and documented war crimes, including indiscriminate bombings, chemical weapon attacks, and systematic torture of detainees. They were intended to pressure the regime and its enablers to cease these atrocities and engage in meaningful political resolution, not to harm civilians. While the unintended consequences of sanctions have undeniably impacted Syrians, it is the regime's deliberate mismanagement and exploitation of these measures that exacerbated civilian suffering. So by hoarding resources, anyways, so this is the point that is most important part. He says that the consequences of these sanctions on the Syrian people were unintended, right? And the second thing is it was all on Syrian regime. So it was the Syrian regime which was basically responsible for every misery that happened in Syria. So how much is this accurate? I had to respond to him like in public this time, because what he said is very, very ridiculous. So what you see on screen is this is a document. This is a secret intelligence document. Goes back to 1993, and then released I think 10 years later, in 2013. This was leaked. This was a top secret document during the times of Serbia. So I told him, this is a response to his comment. I said, I don't buy any of your claims that try to whitewash the dark history of the United States in imposing illegal sanctions on entire nations, primarily driven by foreign policy motives. Take, for instance, the sanctions imposed on Serbia's economy in the early 1990s, designed to create enough hardship for local consumers to spark anti-regime sentiment. So this is a quotation from the document. It says, sanctions have accelerated the downward spiral of Serbia's economy, but have yet to impose sufficient hardships on local consumers needed to spark a groundswell of anti-regime sentiment, reads a declassified US intel document. The US has maintained its sanctions and embargo on Cuba for decades, with no regard for the suffering of ordinary people. US sanctions are directly responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of children in Iraq. The real motivation behind these sanctions has always been geopolitical control, to subjugate populations, demoralize them, and turn them against their governments. Whether or not these governments were tyrannical or violated human rights is irrelevant. If the US truly cared about human rights, the first country it should impose sanctions on is Israel. So, judging from the previous experiences of the US sanctions and the results on the ground, especially on the people, they should know that these sanctions harm the people. And it's not like something unintended and they wanted to avoid these unintended consequences. They have literally stated in a secret document that this is the goal of the sanctions, is to impoverish the people, is to turn them against their government. And this is what happened in Syria. And this is something that has been, in my opinion, not discussed widely, but here we go. We think now that these sanctions unfortunately worked, and they impoverished and demoralized the Syrian people. And just a quick note, right? So this guy is the head of the research in Valiant Projects, and it turned out that this Valiant project is funded by millions by the US aid. Right, so this is the CIA cut out. The CIA basically, US aid funds this project, and this project is now spreading pro-American talking points on social media platforms. I think that this is something that we have to really address and see if any of these people who work in this public field, research, verification, media, press, etc., okay, with which organization you work and who funds this organization, those are very important in my opinion. One of the most disgusting people, in my opinion, who promoted for the regime change for a long time is Wael Zayat. This is a Syrian person in the Washington, D.C., proud Syrian, okay. So he's the CEO of another, I don't know, organization. So he's again calling for lifting the sanctions in order to help the Syrian people recover. But I just want to remind everyone, guys, if you've forgotten about this, I didn't. This is the same guy who published this article in 2022, I believe. When was the earthquake? 2022, 2023. In Aleppo and in the coastal side of Syria. This is an article published by the same person. He said, don't lift sanctions on Syria to help earthquake victims. So I'm just sharing with you these examples for you to see how vile and disgusting these people were in the past. And now they all of a sudden are humanitarian and they want to lift the sanctions because they harmed the Syrian people. So in conclusion about these sanctions, I came to this conclusion, to be honest with you, which is a really bitter and harsh reality. Sanctions against Syria were deliberately designed to starve and break the will of the Syrian people. Now that these cruel measures have achieved their objectives, the United States and its allies will begin lifting them, but only on their terms. The lesson here is crystal clear. Under the iron grip of dollar hegemony, the US can bend any nation to its will, unless that nation possesses nuclear weapons, isolates itself entirely from the global system, or both, as North Korea has done. I don't know if you agree with me. Some people said, no, that's not true. That's not, look at Cuba, look at Venezuela. But I'm watching also Cuba and Venezuela's economies. They can have much more potential and much more prosperity in their countries and less poverty and less economic and financial problems were it not for the sanctions, right? This is what I'm arguing, because US has its grip over the dollar. It can weaponize it. It can sanction people. It can block your reserves. And then it impoverishes your own people, right? Like imagine Venezuela, one of the biggest reserves of oil in the world, and they can have a way better economy than they already have at the current moment. And the reason for it is the sanctions. And of course, this encourages lots of corruption in the country. Once you sanction the economy of the country, you will find you will encourage the establishment of parallel economies which don't belong to the state. And then you have the warlords and the cronies and so many other groups emerge from this, which increases the corruption in this country and hence the anger and the frustration of the people at the government. You know what I mean? And the Americans know it very well. So now with the details of this, the last days of Assad, like I forgot to bring my water. I had the water here. Now I feel so thirsty. Anyways, so let's go through the details of this. I will comment on if there is anything to say about them. So this is from a podcast interview done with someone called Kamel Saqr. Kamel Saqr has been in the past few months the head of the media bureau of Assad's office after the passing of the previous one. The previous one was called Luna Al-Shibl. Luna was a former Al Jazeera anchor, and she left Al Jazeera in 2011 and joined the Assad government. And since then, she became a special advisor in media affairs, etc. She has been very, I would say, obsessed with power and control, and she did lots of problems in the system itself, and she kicked out many people from the system. She isolated many people. She was driven by just power. She was so ruthless, and she passed away in a car accident, and then this guy replaced him for a few months before the regime change happened in Damascus. So what did he say here is some of the information, many of the information, by the way, are correct, just for you to know. So fascinating details about Assad's last days in the interview with Assad's media tsar. His media chief and close aide. He wasn't close aide, by the way. This is not true. Yes, he was the media chief of his office, but he was not a close aide of Assad at all. This is not true. And I know this because I know. I know. Just believe me. Assad in Moscow had to wait 2 days to meet Putin. This is something that he traveled to Moscow when Aleppo was in the process of falling. And if you remember, Putin was not in Moscow. I think he was in Kazan or in Kazakhstan. I don't remember, but he was not in Moscow. So we don't know if Putin let him wait or because he was not in Moscow. So when Assad arrived in Moscow, he waited 2 days for Putin. On the day of the meeting, his appointment was moved 3 times. The Russians asked for only Assad and his escort, Brigadier General Mohsen Mohammad. The meeting lasted for 1 hour. News of the meeting was leaked on Russia-linked Telegram channels, but Putin sent an aide to Assad at his residence at the Four Seasons to tell him personally, after a day's delay and despite protocols, that Putin preferred not to issue official statement about the meeting. Now, this is true. But this was not only leaked on Russian Telegram channels. We also knew about it. It's not something that you can really hide in Syria. We knew about it, and we knew when the flight has departed and when it landed. And I posted about it the moment Assad landed in Moscow. I posted about it, and I received some backlash. People telling me, "Oh, this is not correct. You're spreading fake news." I was like, "Okay, I'm going to delete this post because I don't want to argue with them." And then when there is an official statement, I will repost it again. And there was no official statement, but I received after 3 days another information from Damascus that Assad arrived in Damascus. And then I was like, "Khalas, like he went and he came back. Why am I even trying to hide from the people?" So I posted it again. I don't think those were the Russian Telegram channels. We were even ahead of them in knowing that Assad left to Moscow. So Assad thought Putin probably had his personal reasons not to issue an official statement about the meeting. The Russian plane took them back to Syria on Saturday at 8 p.m. This was the night that I published the moment he arrived. This was 10 p.m. in Damascus. It was around 6 p.m. in Central European time. I published it around probably like 7 p.m. or something in Central European time. So the fall of Aleppo was very shocking for Assad. This is true. Before Aleppo, the development seemed serious, but not too alarming. He had zero expectations such a thing would happen. That's also true. The army was not mentally or logistically ready to fight. Russia was at the peak of its destruction in Ukraine. He was shocked. Many people were shocked. I was not shocked. This is something that I don't really understand. How can state, army, intelligence, allies, satellites, drones, and everything, how could they even be shocked or be surprised by the attack from HTS if I knew about the attack from September 30th, 1.5 months before the attack, reported it on my X account? How can it be that they don't know? How can it be that they were shocked? Like, I'm shocked that they are shocked. You know what I mean? Such a major intelligence failure. In the months before the Aleppo operation, the visibility and presence of Shia militias in Syria had been reduced. This is correct. As Hezbollah received heavy blows in Lebanon, Syria was closely watched by Israel. Again, correct. The Iranian side was also feeling a degree of disappointment seeing a rapprochement between Syria and Arab countries at the expense of its relationship with Iran. Hezbollah had also received its heaviest blow since this. I don't know if the Iranians were disappointed by the rapprochement between Syria and Arabic countries because it wasn't on the expense of Iran. Iran's presence in Syria was already about certain factors, and when these military operations reached their objectives, the Assad government asked them to leave. They don't want it for Iranian forces to stay in Syria forever or Iranian-linked forces. They always had the plan in mind to send them back. This was for a particular purpose. And the presence of the Iranian or Iranian-linked groups were always a major problem for Syria because Syria, as I mentioned, is a majority Sunni country, and Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they always use the presence of the Iranian Shia forces or Iranian-linked Shia forces in Syria to incite the Sunnis against the Shias, right? So Assad knew this. I mean, if Saudi Arabia and Iran made a deal and peace among each other, I don't think there was an issue for Syria to make peace and rapprochement with the Gulf countries in this case. Upon his return from Moscow, Assad met with the political consul, that's true, the foreign minister and his deputy, the vice president and Assad's aide, Busaina Shaban. This is also true. This was the second day. They asked him about the meeting with Putin. Assad told them that Putin rang the Russian army chief of staff in front of him and asked him to do everything to facilitate Iran's air bridge into Syria. I don't know about this. I'm not sure. And we have to dig in more because this could be probably an information which they wanted him to say because he was not present in this meeting, right? He was not. So if anyone can confirm this, it's probably Busaina Shaban. Because if this is not true, then this indicates that Putin betrayed Assad, right? Assad had a very specific request from Putin to personally ensure safety for Iranian military support in Syria, including air supplies. Russia was not in a position to get involved. Iran too. The Iranians told Assad they didn't receive signals or assurances from Russia that it was safe for them to fly to Hmeimim through Iraq. Assad then checked with Moscow, but he got no response. I'm again not sure about this. We have to double check this information because Kamel definitely doesn't know about these things. The Iranians told the Syrians a plane moved nonetheless from Tehran to Syria through Iraq, but were warned by the US that the plane would be shut down if it continues on its way. During this time, the Americans, by the way, bombed the borders. That's true, between Iraq and Syria against Iran-linked groups, and blocked their, let's say, movement from Iraq to Syria to help the Syrian army. In the mind of the Syrian army, the war had been behind it. Psychologically, the military felt that the fighting didn't produce a national value. What is the point of rebooting the war again after 2020? Yeah, that's true. All the conditions were suitable for the operation. The Russians, to them, thought their mission was completed in Syria outside the Syrian equation. Assad wanted Iran to reach out to Turkey, and the Iranians did, but they didn't throw their full weight behind it. He said the Iranians were not as optimistic as they had been in previous situations to enter the war. So on Thursday, December 6th, Turkey told Iran that the time for mediation was over. Why did Assad refuse to meet Erdogan? He says the main reason was Assad's firm belief that meeting Erdogan would involve making political concessions rather than restoring ties. Assad thought he had achieved victory on the ground and was unwilling to offer political concessions. Erdogan was also unwilling to give back territory under his control. In the summer, Assad had 2 meetings with the Russians and the Iranians. The Russians spent half of their meeting talking to Assad about the necessity of meeting Erdogan. To wiggle out it, Assad instead insisted on a deposit similar to Israeli Rabin deposit to his father Hafez. To wiggle out of it, Assad, we spoke about this. The Russians then offered a meeting at the level of foreign ministers. Assad insisted on having only security meetings, usually held privately in Kasab. This is true, by the way. They regularly met in Kasab. This is an Armenian town on the borders between Turkey and Syria. Russia was not happy about it. Iran also proposed the same, to not avail. Assad realized he was in trouble when Putin would not pick up his calls from Tuesday to Thursday. We don't know about this, by the way. This is not confirmed. 3 days before his departure from Syria, at one point, Assad was told Putin was traveling in Belarus and wouldn't be able to take the call. So on Thursday, Assad prepared a 400-word speech to be delivered on television. The speech had several sections. The first, warning about dividing Syria. The second, attacking Turkey and its dishonesty. The third, urging Arab support for Syrian unity. And finally, urging Syrians to fight. This is 100% correct. And there was a speech, but it was not recorded. And it was not like some people argued and claimed that the video was recorded, but it was not televised. There was no speech recorded. But there was a plan to record a speech on the second day, not the day he fled, but the second day. Assad, he says, always wrote his speeches. He said this speech was different. It oozed nervousness and anxiety in its prose and content. It was reflective of his state of mind. He said he was personally surprised by the speech. The plan to give a speech was delayed for a day and then another day. On Saturday, Assad told he no longer planned to give the speech. After Homs, it became clear. After that, the army was dropping its arms. Assad had little doubt at that point. Saturday evening was the last time the media office spoke with Assad. Assad spoke about a military meeting at Hmeimim air base between the Russians and the Syrians. At around 2:15 a.m., his special secretary told Kamel that he, the secretary, would depart. But he wouldn't say where because Assad had left. Earlier at midnight, the Russian military attaché had met Assad to secure his departure. So, I mean, 65% of the statements are correct. And I don't know, Kamel Saqr personally, but I know many of the things that he said, whether it's correct or not. And I would also believe that people like Kamel Saqr were also a problem. Nobody wants to take responsibility for the failures. And because he said that Assad has been very arrogant and stubborn in the compromises and he was detached from reality. And I think if this is true, one of the reasons is people like himself, right? People like himself were they were the ones whispering in his ears and keep telling him how righteous he is and how important his decisions were and how correct his decisions were, and they will keep telling him that he shouldn't compromise. And I know this for a fact. So if you want to blame Assad, 100%, I'm with you. You can blame Assad, but the people like him who are now coming out and say, this is all because of him. No, that's not true. People like him, people like the former head of the political media office, they were all responsible for this situation. So I have 8 minutes to drink water, to wash my face again and go to Judge Napolitano's YouTube podcast, which is going to be in 8 minutes from now. So if you allow me to do that, I would be very appreciative, guys. I started a little bit early, this live streaming. If you're liking this stream, I would be very happy to see you hitting the like button and subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you want to support this work I'm doing, you can become also a patron, or there are other links in the description below. You can check them and see which one do you prefer. I thank you wholeheartedly. And I will go now to the other live streaming with Judge Napolitano in around 7 minutes. So I will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is the 8th of January, 2025 at 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you and upon your families. Salam.